At 82, he moved slowly around his garage, squinting at engine parts through thick glasses, while customers made jokes about the old man who probably learned to fix cars before they were invented. What they didn't know was that Dr. Robert Thompson had learned to split atoms before most people understood what atoms were. Welcome to Stories from Us. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden genius and scientific legacy, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments matter more than you know. Robert Bob Thompson operated a small garage on the outskirts of Millbrook, a quiet town where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. At 82 years old, with gray hair, thick glasses, and movements that had been slowed by decades of hard work, Bob was known to his customers simply as the old mechanic, who could fix anything with an engine but seemed perpetually confused by modern technology. Bob's garage was a modest operation housed in a converted barn that had seen better days. The building was cluttered with tools that looked like they belonged in a museum, spare parts organized in coffee cans and mason jars, and the kind of analog equipment that younger mechanics viewed with a mixture of nostalgia and pity. Bob specialized in older vehicles, cars from the 1980s and 1990s, lawnmowers that had been running for decades, and the occasional antique tractor that local farmers brought in when newer shops turned them away. The customers who frequented Bob's garage had developed a fondness for the elderly mechanic, but they also felt a certain sadness about his situation. They saw him as a lonely old man who had never married, never traveled beyond the county lines, and never adapted to the technological revolution that had transformed the automotive industry. When Bob struggled to operate the computerized diagnostic equipment that Jake Stevens, a young mechanic from town, had tried to teach him to use, customers would shake their heads sympathetically. "Poor old Bob," Sarah Martinez would say when she brought her car in for oil changes. "Technology has just passed him by completely." "Probably never even seen a big city," Tom Wilson would add. "Spent his whole life right here, never learned anything except how to fix engines." Jake Stevens, who occasionally helped Bob with more complex repairs, was less charitable in his assessment. "That old man moves so slow, sometimes it takes him hours just to turn a screw. He can't figure out any of the modern diagnostic equipment, and half the time, I think he's making up solutions as he goes along." Bob heard these comments but never responded to them. He simply focused on his work, meticulously repairing his customers' vehicles with a precision and attention to detail that seemed almost obsessive. He charged modest fees, never complained about difficult jobs, and somehow always managed to fix problems that had stumped other mechanics. What none of Bob's customers could have imagined was that they were watching one of the most brilliant scientific minds of the 20th century troubleshoot their transmission problems and replace their brake pads. Dr. Robert Thompson had earned his Ph.D. in theoretical physics from the California Institute of Technology in 1942 at the age of 22. His doctoral dissertation on uranium fission cross-sections had caught the attention of J. Robert Oppenheimer, who personally recruited him for the Manhattan Project in 1943. For the next 2 years, Dr. Thompson had worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory, contributing to the uranium enrichment processes that would make atomic weapons possible. Thompson's specialty had been critical mass calculations, the precise mathematical work that determined how much fissile material was needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. His equations had been instrumental in the design of both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and his theoretical work on reactor control systems had laid the groundwork for the peaceful applications of nuclear energy that would follow the war. After 1945, Dr. Thompson had remained at Los Alamos, transitioning his expertise to civilian nuclear reactor design. He had consulted on the construction of America's first commercial nuclear power plants, developing safety protocols and emergency shutdown procedures that became standard throughout the industry. His papers on reactor physics had been required reading in nuclear engineering programs across the country. But by the mid-1960s, the weight of his contributions to nuclear weapons development had begun to take a psychological toll. The images from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ongoing arms race with the Soviet Union, and the growing awareness of nuclear weapons' devastating potential had filled Dr. Thompson with a guilt that no amount of peaceful applications could assuage. In 1965, at the age of 45, Dr. Robert Thompson had done something almost unthinkable in the scientific community. He had walked away from nuclear physics entirely. He resigned from Los Alamos, declined offers from universities and private corporations, and disappeared from the academic world that had defined his adult life. The decision to become a mechanic in rural Virginia had been both practical and therapeutic. Thompson had always been good with his hands, and working on engines provided him with the kind of tangible, immediate problem-solving that offered a stark contrast to the abstract theoretical work that had consumed his career. More importantly, mechanical work felt innocent in a way that nuclear physics never could. When Bob fixed a car, he was helping someone get to work or visit family. When Dr. Thompson had calculated critical masses, he had been contributing to weapons of unprecedented destruction. For 30 years, Bob Thompson had lived quietly in Millbrook, maintaining his anonymity through careful avoidance of anything that might reveal his past. He paid his taxes, attended the occasional town meeting, and gradually became part of the local landscape. The only hints of his former life were the precision with which he approached mechanical problems, and the fact that he sometimes muttered calculations under his breath while working, habits that his customers attributed to the quirks of old age. The transformation came on a Friday afternoon, March 15, 2024, at exactly 3:47 p.m. The emergency sirens that began wailing across Millbrook were unlike anything the town had heard before, not the brief tests that occurred monthly, but the continuous urgent warning that indicated a real crisis. Bob was under the hood of Mrs. Henderson's 1998 Ford Taurus, replacing a faulty alternator when the sound penetrated the garage and made him freeze in recognition. He emerged from under the hood and turned on the old radio that sat on his workbench, tuning through static until he found the emergency broadcast. Immediate evacuation of all residents within a 50-mile radius of Three Rivers nuclear power plant. This is not a drill. Repeat. A Level 4 nuclear emergency is in progress at Three Rivers nuclear power plant. Primary coolant system failure has resulted in rapidly rising reactor core temperatures. All residents must evacuate immediately. Bob's face went pale as he absorbed the information. Three Rivers nuclear power plant was 30 miles southeast of Millbrook, close enough that a serious accident could affect the entire region. More significantly, Bob knew Three Rivers intimately. He had been the consulting physicist who had designed its emergency cooling systems in 1971. Outside, Millbrook was descending into controlled chaos. Residents who had never experienced anything more dramatic than a severe thunderstorm were loading their cars with essential belongings, following evacuation routes that existed only in emergency planning documents that most people had never read. Sheriff Williams drove through the streets with his loudspeaker, repeating evacuation orders that grew more urgent with each announcement. All residents must leave immediately. Nuclear plant emergency. Head north or west. Stay away from the plant. This is not a drill. Bob stood in the doorway of his garage, watching his neighbors flee and listening to the radio reports that were becoming increasingly dire. The technical language being used by emergency officials was familiar to him in a way that it wouldn't be to anyone else in town. Reactor scram failures, coolant loop isolation, thermal runaway scenarios. These weren't just abstract concepts to Bob. They were systems he had helped design and potential failures he had spent years trying to prevent. Fire Chief Michael Roberts pulled up in front of the garage, his radio crackling with communications from the emergency command center. Technical team at the plant can't regain control of the reaction. Reactor temperature continuing to rise toward critical levels. We need nuclear specialists on site immediately, but the nearest qualified personnel are hours away. Bob made a decision that he had been avoiding for 30 years. He approached Chief Roberts. "Mike, I think I can help with this situation." Roberts looked at him with the kind of patience reserved for elderly civilians who don't understand the gravity of emergency situations. "Bob, I appreciate the offer, but you need to evacuate like everyone else. This is way beyond anything any of us can handle." "Mike, I'm a nuclear engineer. I know that reactor." Chief Roberts stared at Bob, trying to process what he had just heard. "Bob, what are you talking about? You're a mechanic." "My name is Dr. Robert Thompson. I worked on the Manhattan Project, and I designed the emergency systems at Three Rivers Nuclear Power Plant." The fire chief's expression shifted from patience to confusion to something approaching disbelief. "Bob, this is a life-or-death situation. This isn't the time for jokes or fantasies." Bob walked into his garage and returned with a worn leather wallet that he rarely opened. From it, he extracted a yellowed identification card and several documents that he had kept for 30 years without ever expecting to use them again. Los Alamos National Laboratory, Senior Nuclear Physicist, Dr. Robert Thompson, 1943 to 1965, Consultant for Three Rivers Reactor Design, 1971 to 1973. Chief Roberts examined the documents with growing amazement. The faded photographs matched Bob's younger face, and the technical credentials were beyond anything he could have fabricated. "Jesus Christ, Bob, you're serious about this." "Dead serious, Mike. And if they can't get that reactor under control, we're looking at a meltdown that could contaminate everything within 100 miles. The emergency protocols that followed Bob's revelation moved with surprising efficiency. Within 30 minutes, federal authorities had verified his credentials through classified databases that confirmed not only his identity, but his security clearance level from decades past. Dr. Amanda Foster from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission arrived by helicopter to escort Bob to the Three Rivers facility. "Dr. Thompson," she said as they flew toward the plant, "our records show that you were indeed involved in the original reactor design, but that was over 50 years ago. Are you confident that you remember the systems well enough to be helpful?" Bob looked out at the landscape below, noting the wind patterns that would determine how radioactive contamination might spread if the reactor core breached containment. "Dr. Foster, you don't forget the physics of something you helped create. And more importantly, I remember the vulnerabilities that we built into those systems, vulnerabilities that your current technical team might not know about. The Three Rivers Nuclear Power Plant was in a state of barely controlled crisis when Bob arrived. The control room was filled with technicians and engineers who had been working for hours to regain control of a reactor that seemed determined to destroy itself. Primary coolant pumps had failed, backup systems were not responding properly, and the reactor core temperature was approaching levels that would trigger an automatic emergency shutdown if the automatic systems were still functioning. Plant manager David Kumar looked up as Dr. Foster entered with the elderly man in work clothes. "Who is this?" "Dr. Robert Thompson, Manhattan Project veteran and original consulting physicist for this reactor design." Kumar's skepticism was visible. The situation was too serious for amateur assistants, regardless of what credentials this old man might claim to possess. Bob approached the main control panel and began examining the readings with an intensity that transformed his entire demeanor. The slow, uncertain movements that characterized his work in the garage disappeared, replaced by the focused precision of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Primary coolant pump failure caused thermal runaway in the reactor core," Bob said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades thinking about precisely this scenario. "But the secondary emergency cooling system hasn't been activated properly." "Sir, we've tried everything," said lead engineer Sarah Park, who had been fighting the crisis for hours. "Every protocol we know." "No, you haven't." Bob moved to a section of the control panel that the technicians had largely ignored. The original design included a hidden backup cooling system, a manual override sequence that was never included in the standard operating manuals. The control room fell silent as Bob's hands moved across switches and controls with a confidence that seemed impossible for someone who struggled with a smartphone. He was accessing systems that existed in blueprints that had been classified for decades, implementing emergency procedures that had never been tested because they had never been needed. "Reactor scram in 3, 2, 1. The control rods dropped into the reactor core with a sound that was barely audible but carried the weight of catastrophe averted. The nuclear chain reaction that had been threatening to spiral out of control stopped immediately, and reactor core temperatures began dropping toward safe levels. "How did you know about those systems?" Kumar asked, staring at readings that showed the crisis was over. "Because I designed them," Bob replied simply. I built those emergency overrides into the system because I knew that someday the standard procedures might not be enough. The drive back to Millbrook was quiet, with Bob staring out the window at the landscape that had almost been evacuated permanently. By the time he returned to his garage, word of his role in averting the nuclear crisis had spread throughout the town. Mrs. Henderson was waiting for him when he arrived, her face showing a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment. "Dr. Thompson, Bob, I had no idea who you really were." "You can still call me Bob, Mrs. Henderson. I'm still the same person who fixes your car. But you're a genius, a nuclear scientist who helped create the atomic bomb. And you're still a good customer who needs her alternator replaced." From that day forward, Bob Thompson's life in Millbrook changed in ways both subtle and profound. The townspeople who had seen him as a simple mechanic now understood that they had been in the presence of one of the most significant scientific minds of the 20th century. Some felt embarrassed about their previous assumptions, others felt honored to have known him, and a few felt confused about how to relate to someone whose work had shaped world history. But Bob continued to operate his garage exactly as he always had. He still moved slowly, still squinted at engine parts through thick glasses, and still charged modest fees for his work. The difference was that now, when he muttered calculations under his breath, people listened more carefully, wondering if they were hearing the thought processes of someone who had once calculated the critical mass of uranium for the Manhattan Project. The guilt that had driven Bob away from nuclear physics had not disappeared, but his successful intervention at Three Rivers had provided him with something he had never expected to find: redemption through the application of his knowledge to save lives rather than take them. For the first time in decades, Dr. Robert Thompson felt that his expertise had been used for unambiguously good purposes. Robert Thompson never needed recognition to be brilliant, never needed fame to validate his contributions, and never needed to announce his genius to prove his worth. He found meaning in service itself, whether calculating the physics equations that would end a world war, or replacing the alternator that would get someone safely home to their family. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about what people accomplish when the world is watching. They're about how they carry their knowledge, how they choose to use their gifts, and how they find redemption for past actions through present service. They're about the extraordinary minds that walk among us quietly, carrying capabilities we never think to ask about, ready to step forward when their unique expertise is the only thing that can save us. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Robert Thompson? Someone whose humble exterior concealed extraordinary knowledge, whose quiet service masked world-changing capabilities? Share their name in the comments. Tell us how they taught you that true brilliance often comes without fanfare, that genius can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the most important contributions are often made by people who seek no credit for their actions. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to help us honor the hidden geniuses and quiet heroes who deserve to be remembered. We'll see you in the next story. And until then, remember, the next time you meet someone with a humble appearance and a quiet demeanor, look a little closer. You might be in the presence of an extraordinary mind whose contributions to the world are beyond anything you could imagine.